Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Bookworm Podcast. This week we'll be discussing the novel Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Joining us today on the podcast is the author, George Saunders himself. Thanks for coming on today, George.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, George, as I mentioned, today we'll be talking all about your 2017 novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. Let's get started. Before we delve deeper into the novel, I think it would be a good idea to give the listeners a brief introduction or explanation of the novel. Lincoln in the Bardo is a historical fiction novel based on the real-life death of William, or Willie as he is better known, Lincoln, the son of American President Abraham Lincoln. The novel begins with Willie, who after dying, wakes to find himself in the Bardo, a realm or state between life and death. Did I get all that right, George?
Yep, sure did, Andrew.
Okay, now let's discuss the main characters of the novel. The main characters are Hans Vollman, Roger Bevins III, and Reverend Everly Thomas. Would you mind telling us a bit about each of these three men, George?
I'd be happy to. Hans Vollman is the first character that the reader is introduced to. He is a resident of the Bardo and a printer in life. At 46 years old, he married an 18-year-old named Anna. On the day that the two were going to consummate their marriage, a ceiling beam fell and struck Vollman, killing him. Vollman deludes himself into thinking that he is still alive and recovering in his sick box. Roger Bevins III was a young man who struggled with his homosexuality and is a resident of the Bardo. He fell in love with a man named Gilbert. Gilbert denied Bevins, as Gilbert wanted to live correctly. Bevins slit his wrists, hoping to kill himself, but had a change of heart after what he had done and wanted desperately to live. Bevins believes that he is still alive and recovering. Reverend Everly Thomas is another resident of the Bardo. Unlike Vollman and Bevins, the Reverend knows that he is dead. After his death, as he was being judged for his life, the Reverend saw that he was going to be thrown into hell, and so he ran as far as he could, eventually reaching the Bardo where he remains, afraid to face his final judgment. All three of these men work together to convince Willie Lincoln to leave the Bardo, as it is no place for young ones to tarry.
Thanks, George, for that brief summary of the characters. Let's move on to talk about the style of the novel now. You have a descriptive and flowery style of writing, George, but could you tell us a bit about the unique or experimental style or format of writing you used in Lincoln in the Bardo? While reading the novel, I noticed that the whole book is written similarly to a script.
Sure. I wanted to experiment greatly with my writing of this novel, to write in a style that is unconventional. Eventually, I settled on writing the entire thing in an almost theatrical format, resembling a script with the characters' names at the end of their section instead of the beginning. Throughout the book, the point of view is constantly shifting from character to character, with each character having their own mannerisms and recollection. For example, in chapter 16, when Vollman and Bevins are describing how Abraham Lincoln looked, they have conflicting stories. Bevins says that Abraham was softly sobbing, while Vollman claims that he was not sobbing.
That's very interesting, George. I'd like to add that many of the chapters in the novel are also solely comprised of historical quotes about events such as the party that Lincoln held or how Lincoln reacted to the death of his son. I greatly enjoyed the historical context that these chapters added.
I'm glad you thought so, Andrew. While many of the quotes or excerpts are from historical books or sources, some of the excerpts I came up with myself.
Finally, let's cover some of the themes in Lincoln in the Bardo. Would you mind briefly sharing some of the themes of the book with us?
Sounds good to me. I'll talk about two of the different themes of the book, accepting death and impermanence, as well as unity. Which would you like to start with, Andrew?
How about we start with accepting death and impermanence?
All right, then. At the center of Lincoln in the Bardo is the death of 11-year-old Willie Lincoln and the struggle of Abraham Lincoln to deal with the loss of his son. Abraham loved his son dearly and is devastated by his death, and thinks to himself, is a person to nod, dance, reason, walk, discuss, as before? Was he dear or not? Then let me be happy no more. Lincoln is unsure how he is to proceed with daily life after the loss of his son. Ultimately, Lincoln accepts the death of his son and realizes that he cannot allow it to hold him back, as Willie would not want him to be hobbled by a vain and useless grief. Lincoln was made less rigidly himself through the loss, and therefore quite powerful. As Lincoln had to accept the death of his son, Willie, the residents of the Bardo, including Bevins and Volman, had to accept their own deaths. Throughout the book, many of the residents referred to their coffins as sick boxes and said that they were merely recovering, refusing to admit that they had died. They were afraid to admit their death and tried to convince themselves that they were still alive and needed to get back to their lives. By the end of the novel, most of the residents of the Bardo come to accept that they are no longer part of that previous place and leave the Bardo. Moving on to unity. In the Bardo, all the residents are focused only on themselves. As Bevins explains in chapter 77, to stay in the Bardo, one must deeply and continuously dwell upon one's primary reason for staying, even to the exclusion of all else, which causes all of the residents of the Bardo to remain divided. When all the residents of the Bardo are joined together inside Lincoln, they are bewildered by the effects. They become one mass mind, united in positive intention, and find themselves expanded. Through their unity, Bevins declares that the residents of the Bardo are somewhat restored to their natural fullness, and their physical distortions are reverted. Through their unity, the state of all the members of the Bardo is improved.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. George, I want to thank you for joining me today on the podcast.
It was my pleasure, Andrew.
Once again, we are discussing the novel Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders in this episode. If you have not yet read the book, I would highly encourage that you do so. Thank you to everyone listening, and I hope you will all join me next time. Farewell.